This is, in fact, an ongoing research for me because, as you all know, the war in Ukraine is still raging on, and it remains to be seen how it's going to come to a conclusion. But we will first start with the history of how European security evolved from the end of the Cold War until today, and then we will focus on the reasons that led to what I call the Ukrainian crisis. And then we will move on to the war itself and close with the implications of this war for world and European security. Now, if we are to sum up the evolution of European security from the perspective of the Russians, we can simply call it a grand disillusionment, because in the closing decade of the Cold War, the Gorbachev government in the Soviet and the Yeltsin government of the Russian Federation, for a brief period of time, believed that a genuine collective security partnership between the West and Russia, in which Russia would be recognized as an equal, as a peer to the United States, could be institutionally set up. The story begins in the year 1990, a year after the communist regimes in Central and Eastern Europe had collapsed as a result of popular uprisings. In this year, the Gorbachev government is mired in the consequences of its own unsuccessful reform, and simultaneously they are trying to forge a collective security architecture in Europe around the then Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. And they assume that the practical disappearance of the Warsaw Pact the year before, that is, after communist governments in Central and Eastern Europe collapsed, and the signature of the Charter of Paris alongside the CFE, that is, Conventional Forces Europe Agreement, in which the parties had formally stated that they no longer viewed each other as adversaries, made NATO, just like the Warsaw Pact, obsolete. Now that there was no longer a bipolarity in world politics, surely the great powers dominating the European continent could switch from collective defense of their respective zones of influence to a unified collective security of the entire European continent. Now, they believed that their American counterparts shared this idea. And indeed, during the negotiations on the German reunification, because the East German, that is communist German government, had collapsed, so East and West Germany were to reunite. The Americans told the Russians that NATO's jurisdictions for forces would not move even an inch forward to the east. Later on, they objected that this reference was to East Germany, but not Eastern Europe. But of course, Gorbachev himself contended that their later change of attitude, which resulted in the expansion of NATO towards the Russian Federation and even to former Soviet territory, was clearly a violation of the spirit of the general mood at that time. By the end of 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved, and the Commonwealth of Independent States were established by 12 of the 15 former Soviet republics as the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia had opted out of it. The Russian Federation, of these 12 former Soviet republics, the Russian Federation took over the great power status of the Soviet Union in world politics. It took over its strategic weapons, its space program, its permanent seat in the UN Security Council. Again, initially, just like the Gorbachev government before them, the Yeltsin government in the Russian Federation too believed that they could achieve a democratic capitalist transition of Russia, which would result in Russia's establishment as a European great power on a par with the United States. But unlike in Central and East European countries, where economic and political reform resulted in functioning market economies and functioning democracies, Russian reform resulted in the establishment of a crony capitalist economy dominated by a few oligarchs, very well connected with the government, and an authoritarian presidential system. And what is more, the price of reform, massive deindustrialization, growing inequality, and impoverishment of the ordinary Russian people were by and large burdened on the Russian public. And Russian leadership of the time, particularly figures like Yegor Gaidar, the Minister of Economics in early 1991, 1992, clearly stated that they were left alone by the West, which provided extensive help to Central and East European countries in their reform process, but delegated the support for Russian reform to the IMF, which was a slow, cumbersome international organization. By the time Russia had liberalized prices and bore the brunt of cancellation of state subsidies, the IMF was still debating how much and in what form financial assistance to provide for Russia. Gaidar says it took the IMF 6 months to deliver the first package, by which time inflation in Russia had already increased 12-fold. So this disillusionment resulted from 1993 onwards, actually, in a steady slide of Russia towards a Euro-Asianist, nationalist perspective, which was hostile to the West. So the Russians returned to their age-old position of the other of Western Europe. To put it in more graphic form, throughout the 1990s, transition or reform in Central and Eastern Europe resulted in democratic polity, functioning market economies, and most importantly, membership in NATO and EU. Whereas in Russia and other Commonwealth of Independent States, it resulted in the establishment of authoritarian presidential systems, crony capitalist economies under Russian hegemony. This difference between Central and Eastern Europe and CIS is the practical reason of the redivision of Europe that we are witnessing today. Now, if you ask the Russians, it is the West's fault, who was disproportionate in its support to Central and East European reform and Russian and Commonwealth of Independent States reform. If you ask the West, it is the Russians' fault, who did not commit to reform and did not have a political culture conducive to a capitalist system governed by law and a democratic polity. In other words, the West simply said, reform in Russia didn't work because Russians, the Russian political elite, is deeply corrupt and authoritarian. If you ask me, both sides have, in some respects, right in their criticisms. Now, while NATO held firm and remained a viable military alliance in the west of the continent, collective security in Europe would increasingly be taken over by the Organization on Security and Cooperation in Europe, in the Russian sphere of influence, and NATO itself in the western part of the continent. As NATO enlarged eastwards and Russia forged its own regional hegemony over the CIS countries, the West relied on NATO. And Russia increasingly relied on the OSCE as the legitimating international organization for their peacekeeping missions. This cemented the already apparent political and economic division of Europe with a military one. Now, how did we get to the point of Russian invasion of Ukraine? By the end of the 1990s, Russia had, by and large, consolidated its crony capitalist and authoritarian political system. But as it was established through the loans for shares deal of 1996 under the Yeltsin government, the crony capitalist and authoritarian presidential system of Russia was dominated by the oligarchs, who controlled not just the commanding heights of the Russian economy, which they had acquired for rock bottom prices through the loans for shares deal, but also the government itself, going so far as being represented by one of their own, Vladimir Potanin, as a minister in Yeltsin's cabinet after his re-election in 1996. But as Yeltsin's health was deteriorating, and as the unbound greed and corruption of the oligarchs ravaged the Russian ordinary people, the Russian state, you might call it the deep state of Russia, dominated by Eurasianist nationalists, struck back. And in 1999, they positioned hitherto very little known deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, a former member of the KGB and the FSB, which succeeded the KGB as the intelligence organization of the Russian Federation, first into the position of the director of the FSB, and then acting prime minister. Putin, as acting prime minister, restarted the military operation to establish Russian control in the breakaway region of Chechnya. used the success, the military success in this operation as a leverage for his presidential campaign and succeeded Boris Yeltsin as the new president of Russia. Just like Boris Yeltsin in his initial years, Putin too tried to establish an equal relationship with the United States and the West, a kind of reset with the United States and NATO. Mind you, this is the year right after the Kosovo operation initiated by NATO against Serbia. And this is also the year in which the Russians had to swallow practically the very bitter pill of the first round of NATO enlargement towards Central and Eastern Europe, and the declaration that NATO will expand into former Soviet territory as well by taking in the 3 Baltic republics that had opted out of the CIS. Nevertheless, Putin tried to initiate the reset with NATO, but this reset over time could not stop the deterioration of the relationship between the two sides. Why did the relations deteriorate? First of all, as I said, the Baltic republics were accepted into NATO by 2004, alongside a very large group of East European countries. In the Munich Security Conference in 2007, Russian President Putin, gazing directly at the American Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, throughout his entire speech, asked the following question: against whom is the NATO expansion intended? Because we regard NATO expansion as a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust. So he openly asked the American Secretary of Defense, do you regard us as an enemy? If so, we need to know. The answer came in NATO's Bucharest summit. That same year, Bucharest, as you know, is the capital city of Romania, a former Warsaw Pact country, and an inclusion to NATO as a result of its second round of enlargement. In the paragraph 18 of the Bucharest Summit Declaration, NATO responded to Putin's question in Munich. We reiterate, they said, that decisions on enlargement are for NATO itself to make, practically precluding any notion of political dialogue and negotiation on the direction and speed of NATO enlargement with Russia or any other party. By paragraph 18 of the Bucharest Summit Declaration, NATO clearly said, sorry, whoever applies and whoever we think is suitable will become a member of NATO. Throughout this period, starting with the October 2000 bulldozer revolution of Serbia, a series of color revolutions took place. For Russia, the most consequential of these color revolutions were the Rose Revolution of Georgia in 2003 and the Orange Revolution of Ukraine in 2004. These revolutions created, by and large, anti-Russian and pro-European, pro-Western governments, literally at the back door of Russia, or what the Russian security policy created by Yevgeny Primakov during the 1990s had referred to as Russia's near abroad. For Russian security concerns, these developments, that is, loss of Russian political, military, and economic dominance, hegemony over former Soviet republics like Ukraine and Georgia, were unacceptable. They deemed this as an existential security problem and struck back. Supporting secessionist movements in Georgia, Russia used them to initiate a military operation to invade Georgian territory in 2008, practically smashing the security forces of the pro-American Georgian government under Mikhail Saakashvili. And they sponsored the election of the pro-Russian candidate Viktor Yanukovych, a former governor of the Donetsk Oblast, which is currently under Russian occupation in Ukraine, and known for its predominantly Russian-speaking population. So Viktor Yanukovych, representing Ukraine's Russian-speaking East, became president of Ukraine in 2010 through an election which European observers themselves deemed as free and fair. So the Russians were on a very steep learning curve. And from their perspective, they were playing the game initiated by the West. If you want to play political warfare on our backyard, let's play. That was their attitude. This attitude was further entrenched by the developments that followed, because in 2010, the Arab Spring reached Syria and Libya. And while in Libya, the civil war resulted in the toppling of Muammar Gaddafi, in Syria, the Russians and the Chinese firmly stood behind the government of Bashar Assad. And more importantly, they deemed the entire Western effort to support the Syrian opposition as yet another attempt at subverting a Russian client state. For them, this was just another indication, just another appearance of Western aggression. Then in 2013, at the peak of the Syrian civil war, but before the Euromaidan protests of Ukraine, while Ukraine was still negotiating with the European Union for a free trade agreement, a trade and association agreement, and considerable financial packages with the Russian government. And the president of the country was still the pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych. The Russian Chief of General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, wrote an article. The article was published in the Military Industrial Courier, whose readership comprises of the top-ranking military and the leaders of Russia's largely state-controlled defense industry. And in this article, Gerasimov, without mentioning the actual term, described Western way of promoting democracy and peace enforcement and peacekeeping operations as a form of hybrid warfare. Hybrid because it combines political warfare, non-kinetic means, with conventional war, that is kinetic. And according to Gerasimov, the color revolutions, the Arab Spring, everything that was happening around Russia, which the West described as democracy promotion, non-violent democracy promotion, or overt programs, open legal programs. The Russians, through Gerasimov article, described these as part of a war effort. The importance of the Gerasimov article is not just because it laid down the basics of what we now call hybrid warfare, but it also showed from a very high up authority, chief of the general staff of the country, that the Russians regarded themselves as being at war. And they regarded the West as the aggressor. This is the reason why, from 2013 onwards, particularly after the Euromaidan or Revolution of Dignity uprisings in Ukraine that started in November 2013 and resulted with Yanukovych's toppling. He had to flee to Russia, and his replacement with a pro-Western government. The Russians believed that their assumptions about them being at war and the West being the aggressor were now justified. They thought, see, only a few months after the article, there you go. First, they started the protests, then the protests got violent, then it resulted in a coup. This is the reason why the Russians, from February 2014 onwards, did not regard the Ukrainian government as a legitimate government. The Russian claim was this: this is a coup government, and the perpetrators of the coup are, as the Russians call them, neo-Nazis. Why do they call them neo-Nazis? Well, historically, Ukrainian nationalists had collaborated with the invading German army at the outset of the Second World War. Okay? This is a common feature of most nationalist and anti-communist movements throughout the Balkans and Soviet territory. When the Germans invaded, the nationalists of these countries usually collaborated with the Germans against their communist occupiers. Not because they actually liked the Germans or the Nazis, but because they wanted to get rid of the communists. In the end, of course, the Soviet Union liberated all these countries by invading them again. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, when communism collapsed across Central and Eastern Europe and former Soviet territory, one of the inherent problems of nationalist legacy had been the moment you harked back into history to look for national heroes, to base your nationalist mythology on their actions and words, you came at the very unpleasant fact that some of those heroes happened to be collaborationists during the Second World War. So the Russians very shrewdly used this fact, calling the Ukrainian nationalists who had celebrated the anti-communist Ukrainian nationalists of the Second World War as neo-Nazis. They said the Ukrainian nationalists of the Second World War were Nazis. They collaborated with the Nazis. The people who celebrate them today, they are Nazis too. Okay? Hence, in 2014, the Russians, now believing that they were under attack and therefore free to respond with military force in complete disregard of international law, proceeded to first annex Crimea, which was strategically very important for the Russians because it housed the Russian Black Sea Fleet's primary base in the city of Sevastopol, and then provided military and logistics support for separatists in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine in the east. As the conflict between the Western-sponsored government of Ukraine and the Russian-sponsored separatists in the east continued for the remainder of the decade, one very important indicator shows us the Russian mindset, just like the Gerasimov article of 2013. In 2016, in the year Donald Trump was elected in the United States, acclaimed American director, filmmaker, and political activist, we must say, Oliver Stone, prepared a documentary called Ukraine on Fire. This was one of a series of documentaries. He also prepared one to celebrate the anti-American governments across Latin America. So this wasn't his first politically activist documentary. Ukraine on Fire was a brazen pro-Russian documentary. It was very generous towards Yanukovych, his security apparatus, and of course Vladimir Putin himself, with extensive interviews with all of these figures. And in those interviews, Putin clearly stated what hitherto could be only implied or assumed from the Russian position. He said, we don't regard the Ukrainian government as a legitimate government. We believe we are at war. The government in Ukraine was toppled by putschists who are neo-Nazis. And the West is waging hybrid warfare against us. So, from this interview, it was clear that the Russians regarded themselves as being under attack, and the West as the aggressors. So, why did we wait until war struck in Ukraine for another 6 years? The answer is actually very easy to find. As I said, in the year 2016, Donald Trump was elected as the new president of the United States. And Trump decidedly moved towards a more isolationist position in international relations. And one of his primary moves was to reduce American sponsorship to America's European allies. And since Trump himself also sort of aspired to be a strong man, like Putin, he initiated a high-level, one-on-one personal relationship with Vladimir Putin, which helped to ease the tensions between Russia and the United States for that time period. However, by 2020, Trump lost the election. He was replaced by the Biden administration, which returned to a much more internationalist and interventionist posture and expressed its solidarity with the pro-Western government in Ukraine in much more open terms. This led to the Ukrainian situation turning into a crisis in the year 2021 as the world was reeling under the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And by 2022, the Russians attacked and invaded Ukrainian territory. The Russian attack was a complete surprise, even to Putin's own National Security Council. And this is also one of the reasons why Russia failed in its attempt at what is called a decapitation strike. The thing is this: Russia attacked Ukraine with a peacetime army of approximately 300,000 troops. They did that right after the Zapad 2021 military maneuvers jointly conducted with Belarus. The American and British intelligence picked up the Russian preparations for war. This gave Ukraine the time to prepare for the attack. The Russians had utterly misjudged the political situation in Ukraine and the military preparedness of the Ukrainian army, because they believed this would be a walk in the park. First, Russian elite troops would land at the Antonov airport outside Kiev. From there, they would march into Kiev, at which point the Zelensky government would either be fleeing or captured or killed. Then Russian units from 3 different directions would enter Ukrainian territory, and they would look like a peacekeeping or peace enforcement operation. They believed that in the Russian-speaking east of Ukraine, the Russian forces would be greeted with sympathy. And since the pro-Western government in Kiev was already toppled as a result of a decapitation strike in the first 48 hours of the operation, the western part of the country, the Ukrainian nationalist, Ukrainian-speaking western part of the country, wouldn't resist. But the decapitation strike launched towards Kiev from the Antonov airport in Hostomel met with a very stiff resistance from the Ukrainian forces. Zelensky established himself as a wartime leader by refusing Western offers for an evacuation with a now famous one-liner. "The war is here," Zelensky replied to his American counterparts. "I need ammunition, not a ride." The army and the people of Ukraine united under his leadership, and the Russians, who thought this whole operation would be something like a peacekeeping or peace enforcement operation, found themselves in a full-blown conventional war with inadequate numbers of troops and logistics. The West, which had already prepared for the eventual Russian invasion, succeeded in uniting the rest of the world in a near universal condemnation of the Russian military operation as an illegal act of aggression, followed by very heavy Western sanctions against Russia, its political leadership, its economic units, and corporations. The West not only sanctioned Russia, but they also provided extensive military and economic support for the Ukrainian war effort, without which Ukraine could not have sustained the war against Russia, because Ukraine, at the end of the day, is a middle power in terms of demographics, manufacturing, technology, and military power. One of the most, elemental, rudimentary parts of conventional warfare today is artillery shells, in particular 155 millimeter artillery shells. Ukraine can't produce them. It has to be supplied. This means hundreds of thousands of artillery shells. Without Western support, Ukraine could not have prevailed. But as heroic as the Ukrainian resistance was, the failure of Russia is also attributed to the unwillingness of the Russian political leadership. Of course, when we say Russian political leadership, we are actually talking about one person, Vladimir Putin's unwillingness to deploy the full military power of the country. He couldn't bring himself to accept that subduing Ukraine would take the full array of Russian military might. It took him a year almost to finally decide on partial mobilization and, more importantly, delivering the overall command of the war effort to professional military. Because at the beginning of the war, because of inadequacies of conventional military power, the Russian war effort was waged by and large by mercenaries like the Wagner Group or militias hailing from disparate regions like Dagestan, Chechnya, as well as the separatist militias from eastern Ukraine. So the Russian army in the field looked more like a medieval army in which command and control was impossible to maintain. Of course, much was made of this strategic blunder of Russia. Some people attributed it to Vladimir Putin's psychology and delved in studies of leadership profiles of Putin. Others accentuated the role of his opponent, that is, Volodymyr Zelensky, who used to be a comedian, but shined as a wartime military leader. Still others attributed the Russian failure to the echo chamber effect amongst the strong men, the Siloviki of Russia, who did not tolerate disparate views on important matters. Putin essentially surrounded himself with yes men. Still others pointed at the international conjecture in which the United States was governed by the old and frailing Joe Biden right after a very tumultuous election and the January Congress raid of Trump supporters, while Europe was reeling from the impact of Brexit and Germany was under a very weak coalition leadership after 17 years of Angela Merkel chancellorship. Still others looked at Russia's recent gains and consolidation of Russian hegemony over the CIS region as a result of developments in places like Nagorno-Karabakh or in Kazakhstan, or Belarus, we can add. Still others referred to the impact of new technology in conventional warfare, particularly that of drones and infantry used anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons. Some expressed their suspicions of Putin's health for the poor timing of the Russian attack. And of course, as this discussion went on, both sides engaged actively in information operations as part of their political warfare campaign against each other and against their own populations. So much so that in Russia, calling what was happening in Ukraine a war became a criminal offense. While in Europe, any accreditation of Russian argument or any toleration of Russian sense of disillusionment and betrayal by the West was immediately branded and exposed as Putinism. So the result was the publics of both sides are by and large unaware of the real situation on the ground. The Americans and the Europeans, by and large, think that Ukraine can win this war, and the Russian public, by and large, thinks that they are fighting the entirety of NATO in Ukraine, and not just Ukraine itself. Now, where did this leave us? For the first year of the war, generally the Ukrainians had the upper hand. And it was during the first spring of the war in 2022 that the parties sat down on negotiations for a ceasefire through Turkish enabling in Istanbul. This, I contend, was a missed opportunity because the talks had produced significant progress. But as Ukrainian sources later revealed, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, a chief advocate for Ukrainian resistance against Russian aggression and one of America's steadfast allies in this effort, visited Kiev and encouraged President Zelensky not to sign a compromised peace. And he promised modern Western offensive weapons which would enable Ukraine to reclaim its territory by force. Indeed, venerated politicians like Henry Kissinger were publicly shamed and pushed into silence for suggesting during this period that Ukraine might seek a compromised peace and ceasefire as a practical current solution. This is important. Kissinger didn't say Ukraine should forget about Crimea or Eastern Ukraine. He merely said, accept ceasefire now for your own good. Reclaim your territory later at a more opportune moment in history. In fact, a very recent example of such patient and prudent behavior had just borne fruit in the CIS territory in Nagorno-Karabakh. Azerbaijan, which had to live with the fact that 20% of its territory remained under Armenian occupation for 3 decades, finally reclaimed its territory as its army was propped up thanks to soaring oil prices in the previous 2 decades and significant Turkish assistance and reorganization, and the conjuncture in which the Armenian government lost Russian support. It is important to note that the Western refusal for Ukraine to sign a compromised peace wasn't just lip service. They did provide Ukraine very significant amounts of offensive weapons. Most importantly, modern armor, tanks. But although receiving extensive Western equipment and training throughout the winter of 2022 and 2023, the Ukrainian counteroffensive that started in the late spring and summer of 2023 failed to achieve the desired results. One reason was because the West, although delivering significant amounts of weapons and training, failed to deliver the air superiority weapons, modern fighter aircraft, that would have immensely changed the situation on the ground. And secondly, the Russians, because they too had a year to prepare now, did establish very deep defensive lines in the area where the attack was expected, and showed that they could implement the lessons learned from their previous year of misery in the field of battle, like the deployment, extensive deployment of drones. Indeed, the Russians first organizationally changed the way they fought the war. With the Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu and Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov taking full control of the war. Second, they also convinced the president to pay the rather unpleasant political price of declaring partial mobilization, thereby remedying their acute manpower shortages characterizing the first phase of the war. While very extensive Russian equipment losses, thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, armor, all sorts of weaponry lost during the early phases of the war, were resupplied through emergency deals with client states like North Korea or proxies like Iran. The Russians also geared up their economy to a war footing, thereby not only managing to survive the crippling effect of Western sanctions, but also managing to supply their army in the field. The result, the combined result of all these efforts were visible by the spring, early spring of 2024, at which time the Ukrainians themselves estimated that the Russians were deploying 30,000 new troops every month to the field. This is the equivalent of an entire corps. That's 3 or 4 brigades. If the Russians keep up this momentum, by mid-summer, the situation on the ground will most likely be very difficult to maintain for Ukraine. Because while all this was happening on the Russian front, in the Ukrainian front, things were not going as planned, because Western partners of Ukraine floundered in their support. Both the European Union and the United States hesitated to supply Ukrainians with more advanced weapons. The Republican opposition in the US Congress critically delayed a $60 billion assistance package to Ukraine. And although this package has recently passed the US Congress, it will take time for Ukraine's Western allies to deliver the much needed equipment. In addition, of course, we should also mention the very simple fact that Russia has 3 times the population of Ukraine. It keeps roughly 20% of Ukraine under occupation. So a significant part of Ukraine's population are actually fighting on the Russian side. An equally significant part, nearly 10 million, are dislocated, either within or outside Ukraine. And the Ukrainian government, for political reasons, is loath to lower mobilization age below 25 years, which severely restricts their pool of manpower available for the continuation of the war effort. So continuing the war is a double-edged sword for the Ukrainians. If they lower mobilization age, receive extensive Western support, and take on the Russian army in the field, they may eventually convince the Russians to a standstill. But if they don't, if they can't, they would conventionally lose the war and pay its political price. So this is where we're at now. Now, in terms of the consequences of the war in Ukraine, we can cite the following. One, the war of Ukraine resulted in the waning of deterrence in a multipolar, over-globalized, and hyper-interdependent world. We are now closer to an eruption of general war among great powers than any time in the previous century. The crisis owes a large part to what we call the war party in Washington. Surely, Putin's invasion of Ukraine is an ill-judged and illegal action, an act of aggression. But wearing down Russia as a war aim is a stated aim of the Biden administration. And it is a very dangerous aim, particularly because it is combined with 1980s style, empire of evil, Ronald Reagan style Russia bashing. Because establishing relative conventional and nuclear stability on the war-torn continent of Europe was a painful and long process. These actions are undoing the consequences of that process. And no amount of damage inflicted on Russia can justify this erosion of peace and security in Europe. Because at the end of the day, Russia will remain as a great power. It's not going to implode. It's not going to lose its nuclear weapons. Or let me put it this way, I hope they don't, because this would create an immense array of other security problems on their own. For the world economy, the supply chain disruption attended by higher inflation is threatening fragile third world economies, particularly in developing countries. For the international system, the emerging Sino-Russian axis to counterbalance American hegemony and the transatlantic alliance is increasingly taking shape, which is another ominous sign because it is involving China into this conflict. China, which is already America's target for containment for the following part of this century, and China, which is already a hot spot due to Taiwan and its claims in the East China Sea. And finally, the war in Ukraine, compounded by the deterioration of global security architecture and posture, results in a rearmament of all great powers, but most notably that of Germany and Japan, which had traditionally pursued a pacifist policy since the end of the Second World War. The reawakening of these two giants and their rearmament is going to have serious consequences for the remainder of this century. These are seminal events that we are witnessing right now. We are not going to see their consequences immediately. Current German rearmament is at its very early stages, and military experts make a lot of mockery of their consequences. The Germans, with pomp and ceremony, decided to join the Allied efforts in the East China Sea, and they deployed a frigate, a single ship, relatively tiny compared to the giant supercarriers of their American allies or China's new fleet. But if the Germans keep expending 100 billion euros in emergency funds for the following 5 years, this amounts to €500 billion. And that's a lot of euros to spend on defense alone. The consequences of such expenditure would be bound to be significant. On Europe, and this is where I finish, the security of Europe is bound to solve the following question. How can you have pan-European security while you are regarding Russia as a threat? Because Russia is in Europe. It's not like you can kick them behind the Ural Mountains. So how can you have pan-European security and regard Russia as a threat? Without Russian collaboration, you cannot have an enduring security architecture that encapsulates the entire continent. Moving to the other end of the continent, what are we to do with Britain, which is currently featuring as a British Robin to a Batman USA? You know, in the series Batman, Batman is the main character and Robin is his sidekick. Similarly, in the global security scene right now, the United States is the main character and Britain appears as its sidekick, but with very consequential, as we had seen in the case of Boris Johnson's intervention in the spring of 2022, actions. Speaking of the main cast, what would a possible re-election of Donald Trump bring to European security architecture? Because Trump may simply return the United States to the kind of isolationism that Vladimir Putin so much likes. This would leave practically the Europeans to fend for themselves against a very angry Russia. You know, it's like waking up, poking, provocating a bear, and then just leaving the neighborhood, so that your friends in the neighborhood have to deal with this bear on a rampage right now. And the Germans would be like, who the hell woke this up? You know. Talking about Germans, of course, in the event of an American departure and continuing Russian ressentiment, it would fall upon the Germans to practically finance and enable the defense of the continent. Now, I just added this meme, which was very popular in the early days of the Ukrainian war, which says, as a German, I just want to get something straight. The entire Western world wants us to build up a huge army, march through Poland, fight the Russians if needed. When was the last time this happened? The Second World War, and none of us liked the consequences, if you remember. There is no reason why we should like them this time. And whether the Americans stay or not, in the long run, how will Europe deal with the problem of refugees, which are in their millions right now due to dislocation as a result of the Ukrainian war, the energy supply security as a result of ongoing sanctions against Russia, and more importantly, the future of the European project, as new right or extreme right political movements are gaining momentum across the Union. Again, another side effect of the war. Beyond the European Union itself, we have questions concerning the transatlantic alliance, or NATO. There is an apparent division in Europe in which East European countries, particularly countries like Poland or Romania, increasingly lend themselves to instrumental relationships with the United States against Russia, taking on very provocative security risks for themselves, but also for the entire alliance. This is understandable from the perspective of these countries who feel Russian threat much more acutely. But this division, first coined by Donald Rumsfeld, then Secretary of Defense of the United States during the invasion of Iraq, between old Europe and new Europe, is bound to have serious consequences over the long term for the future of NATO as a coherent collective defense organization. Another question, of course, is NATO enlargement beyond Finland and Sweden. Is the addition of security as a result of the inclusion of former Soviet countries or CIS countries like Georgia and Ukraine worth the security consequences of these inclusions, which the Russians regard as existential threats? Do we really need this? And if so, against whom? If it's against Russia, it makes no sense, because their inclusion only aggravates the Russian threat. And now you have to defend them because they are NATO allies. And finally, and this is where I stop, This puts countries like Turkey into a very difficult situation, because Turkey is a middle power which has very troubled relationships both with NATO as an organization, the EU as an organization, and the individual great powers within these two organizations, most prominently with the United States and with Germany. Turkish relationships with these two major actors, in addition to institutional relationships with these two organizations, will by and large determine not just Turkey's future in the continent, but they will be consequential in how major security concerns on the continent are going to play out. Not least the war in Ukraine. You can add to this questions of energy security, natural gas, and economic zone partition in Eastern Mediterranean, the Cypriot problem, Turkish-Greek problems, Syria, the ongoing war in Gaza, and you would realize that European security without Turkey's positive contribution is very difficult to achieve. And for the time being, as a Turkish scholar of security studies, I must say it is becoming increasingly more difficult for Turkey to make that positive contribution. And the country itself is not entirely to blame on this situation. Both the Transatlantic Alliance and the European Union need to reassess their position vis-a-vis their ally. Because the current situation is simply untenable. And with this, on this happy note, I conclude my presentation. Thank you for listening.